Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 277 of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technological firm that helps clients manage risks across 4 key risk areas. These risk areas include sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, human capital, including employees and contractors. You can find out more information on the Red Flag Group at their website, www.redflaggroup.com. Today I have back with me Jared Connors. Jared is Product Development Manager at the Red Flag Group, and we are going to discuss gathering materials from your suppliers to better understand their business practices. This is part of our ongoing podcast series on supplier risk management, which is in conjunction with the more comprehensive webinar series the Red Flag Group is putting on regarding supply chain risk management. The webinar will be held on Thursday, September 15th at 10 a.m. Central. It is absolutely free. You can register and get more information at the Red Flag Group website. So go to www.redflaggroup.com and go to the webinars tab. In this podcast, Jared explains how you work with your suppliers to gather information, as suppliers are really part of your overall solution. So you need to understand what is the process for developing information, what's the cultural differences between the parties, how suppliers can help you create a supplier audit plan, and keys to managing the approach. The episode comes in at just over 17 minutes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening. Today I have back with me Jared Connor. Jared and I are both with the Red Flag Group, and I'm very excited to talk to Jared about an upcoming Red Flag Group webinar entitled Gathering Materials from Your Suppliers to Better Understand Their Business Practices. This is one more in our continuing series of webinars on supply chain risk management, which is an important topic, yet a topic that doesn't get as much play as I think is needed in the general anti-corruption, anti-bribery world. So with that somewhat long-winded introduction, Jared, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So Jared, as I mentioned on this webinar, it's going to focus on gathering materials from your suppliers to better understand their business practices. From your perspective as a former supply chain, I think you call yourself geek, but I don't want to insult you if that's not right, but certainly a former supply chain aficionado, why is the gathering of the materials so important in the overall process?
Well, if I could sum up why this is important of gathering materials and information from your suppliers, is this is one of the best ways to keep your costs down on your supply chain risk solution. And what I mean by that is a lot of times companies will say the only possible solution to evaluating suppliers' stance to risk is by doing physical audits, when as we all know those can be very expensive. And so I think that one of the best things that I've seen in my 10 years of doing this is actually working with suppliers to gather information from them in order to understand how they view and stand against particular risk areas.
Well, how does this work into the theme of these series of webinars on managing your supply chain risk? How does having the suppliers sort of self-evaluate their own risk help you as a supply chain purchaser, Jared?
Sure. Well, and keeping in theme with our technology platform, Supplier Integrity, and also some of the best practices I've seen out there in the industry, is that in order to evaluate suppliers, we need to involve them. And a lot of technology platforms are based on communication with the supplier. And we've created a platform that says we understand that people need to gather information on and from their suppliers, and we also need to automate processes. And so what we're trying to do is incorporate those best practices into our technology. So what we've done is say, what's so important about gathering information from the suppliers? Well, it's because I want to be able to understand or analyze their stance to a particular risk area. So I want to be able to hold a repository of that information. So I'm going to use, in our example, a technology platform that's going to enable my process for gathering information from the supplier. Again, going on with that theme of let's try and help companies make the most out of their risk assessment process by keeping their costs down. And audit may be a solution, but this is that precursor for you to be able to keep your people costs down, and then of course your process costs down.
Jared, one of the things I've been intrigued with in working with you on this supply chain risk management set of webinars is the view you seem to have that suppliers are really part of a corporate solution. And I have to contrast that with my background as a lawyer, where it was arm's length, kind of us at them at all times. But you have a very different way of looking at this. Could you explain why why you see suppliers as really part of the overall corporate solution?
Yeah, that was ingrained in me early on in my career in the electronics industry when I was, the acronym changes all the time. First it's CSR, corporate social responsibility, then it's ESG, environmental social governance, and now the theme is responsible sourcing. But all the while, I always sat in a procurement organization. So the first training I got wasn't on supply chain risk. It wasn't on environmental or social or regulatory requirements. It was on how to work with suppliers. And what I learned from procurement organization was that it's a big myth, I'll say, out there that people have this huge stick that they can wield at suppliers. Not only do organizations not want to wield that stick at suppliers because it makes the relationship somewhat tenuous, but they also want to make sure that they're fostering those suppliers, that they're building those relationships. Because the truth is that people, or organizations, need their suppliers as much as the suppliers need them. And so that was kind of pushed on me in an early process to say that you have to make this work with your suppliers. And again, one of the most value-add activities I found from working with suppliers is by simply asking them questions and involving them in the process, because you're going to learn so much more by involving them in the process than, I'm going to pick on it again, than by, say, a surprise audit right up front. And an audit may be the right solution, but it may not necessarily be the right upfront solution, because the more that you engage your suppliers, the more you learn from your suppliers, the more they're going to be able to and understand what and how to reveal to you throughout the process.
Jared, could you just tell us what the process is? You've used that word a couple of times. I wanted to ask, what is the process?
The process that we've identified, and we say, here's your manageable approach. And what are the keys to that manageable approach? So we've identified a 4-step process for working with suppliers to building a quality program. We call those identify, collect, evaluate, and mitigate. And those are pretty self-explanatory. In the beginning, it's identify your risks. Which suppliers represent the biggest potential for risk? Who are those suppliers? What should I focus on when talking to them? And then it's, now I'm going to collect, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to collect information on and from the suppliers to evaluate their process. I'm going to learn about their, say, policies and procedures. If your focus is, well, let's use a familiar one to Red Flag Group. If your focus one is anti-corruption, what is the supplier's stance to that in their sales channel? What are they going to do to ensure that their employees and their distributors, their third-party service providers, are actually adhering to that program? That's the best way, in my opinion, to learn from a supplier. And then, now that I've collected that information on and from the supplier and evaluated their policies, or I've now got their policies, I'm going to evaluate those, and I'm going to understand what those policies say against what my expectations of the supplier is, and see if those line up. And that's so important, I think, to be able to demonstrate that you're essentially in adherence to your own code of conduct, is to say, here's my code of conduct, here's my expectations, basically what I'm saying for my suppliers. Now, here's what I'm doing to hold myself accountable to the very rules that I came up with on my company for my supply chain. And that evaluation process is so important. And then the mitigate phase, again, going back to my early days that were ingrained in me of that we have to involve the suppliers and we have to make them a part of the solution, is mitigate doesn't always mean I'm now dropping this hammer on you or I'm getting rid of you, because most procurement organizations will tell you that either A, they can't get rid of a supplier, or B, they simply don't want to for whatever business reason it may be, like cost or availability or business continuity issues. They want sources for various piece parts and products. And so when you go to mitigate, I think of mitigate as what's the best way that we can work with this supplier to, say, up-level their practices and make them line up with my code of conduct expectations, or how can I then further evaluate this supplier to really dive into a potential issue. And I give an example all the time of back in my early days of when, long before anti-human trafficking regulations, when we used to call it the Working Hours Task Force, and we would look at the potential for bonded labor, and we would see that through audit results, observations and findings from auditors, that passports of migrant workers were being withheld or being hung onto by the organization. And then when we would actually create that conversation, start that conversation with the organization, we'd find that that was absolutely not the case whatsoever. It was a complete cultural misunderstanding. They weren't hanging on to or withholding these passports. They were simply hanging on to them for safekeeping, and at any point in time, the employee could grab their passport and their travel documents and be free of the organization if they so much as wanted to, or simply travel away. But that was our cultural misunderstanding, because we view that as bonded labor according to the 3 anti-human trafficking regulations. So that's why I think it's so important that when you go through the process, all the way from identify to mitigate, that we have a conversation, a dialogue with the supplier to say, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Why is this important to you? Or is it something that you're just not necessarily consciously making an effort to do, and you're not even aware that this could be an issue for your customer downstream?
Jared, you've mentioned supplier audits a couple of times. Do you advocate having this sort of robust conversation with suppliers about audit and audit plans as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you start to go through the process of auditing suppliers, it's really important to, I don't want to say necessarily publish your audit plan, but make the stakeholders aware of what you're doing throughout your audit process. And so I think that one of the things that are so important up front is to talk about this internally. So let's say you're a CSR representative and you're about to execute a particular supplier audit program within your calendar year or your fiscal year, and you've got a budget for whatever number of audits, and it's about getting down to those ones that really need to be audited. It's about communicating with your procurement group and then also the suppliers themselves. And it doesn't have to be, hey, Acme Sprockets, I'm going to be auditing you by November, and here's what this audit is going to entail. It might be this communication where you simply publish to your supply chain, here's our plan for audit and our objectives from doing this audit plan. And that's number 1. And then 2, sharing the process by which you go through selection for audits. What's the criteria by which you select suppliers for audits? Sometimes it's supplier awards or top spends, criticality to business. What are you doing in order to make that evaluation? I think it's really important to involve all the stakeholders, not just the suppliers at this point, but also your procurement organization, so they understand what expectations are going to be from that audit. And then one thing, skipping to the end, so I kind of have this 4-part process, supplier audit of audit plan, selection, reporting, and mitigation, but I'm going to skip to one important piece that I think often gets overlooked, and communication back to the supplier post-audit.
Right.
If I had $1 for every time I saw a supplier come to me and say, well, I have no idea what happened. You were here for 4 days and tore me apart, and I don't even know, did I pass? Am I good? Am I bad? Like, what's going on here? And I think that everybody in their upfront audit planning should identify the scope of those audits and also the scope of the communication back to the supplier and what your result of that evaluation is. And that's really fostering relationships is what that does. And not only that, but it helps the supplier understand what they might need to focus on going forward, because obviously they're your supplier for a reason, because they want to get your business.
Jared, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I was wondering if you might be able to sum up the keys to creating a manageable approach for this area of supply chain risk management.
Sure. So we talked about the identify, collect, evaluate, and mitigate. So let's talk more broadly about this. So, and I talked about supplier audit planning. So let's talk more broadly about, say, a supply chain risk management process. So I think what's important up front is to sit back and take a break before you're jumping into your annual engagement of suppliers and say, what is my program plan? What am I going to do? How am I going to go out and identify what risks are in my supply chain and which suppliers represent the biggest risk? And then also I call it documenting a program procedure. What am I going to do to identify and collect? And then how am I going to conduct my evaluation? Is audit still up front in the collection part? I think it can be 1 and 2, meaning collect and evaluate. But writing up that program up front to say, here's my process and how I'm going to do this, and then demonstrating how you execute it at the end of your program period, your year or whatever it may be, is one of the best ways to say that this is how good my program is, how robust my program can be, and what areas for improvement I actually have in it. And a good example of that I see that's happened out there in the market is in the food industry. And I think we all remember I think it was Indonesian case for shrimp farming. And there was an organization, a company that we probably all know here in the U.S. That went out and said, I'm going to self-audit. And I think the reason why they got so much credit on that report that they produced that said, here are our findings, the negative findings against our own process and our own supply chain that we found, was that they actually said, here's what our expectations are, here's what we set out to do and deliver, and then here's how we perform to our own expectations and delivery. And that's why I think they were set so high on a pedestal after that deprecation, essentially, by saying, hey, we found these negative findings, but look what we set out to do, and here is our actual evaluation of how we stacked up against our own expectations. And I think that creating that program procedure up front is one of the best ways to then, even if you have a negative like that company had, to demonstrate then what you did throughout your year and really show what your program was all about. Not just, I audited some suppliers and here's what I found or didn't find.
Well, Jared, this has been a really informative podcast. I really appreciate the insights you brought to us. But I was wondering if anyone wanted to contact you directly or had any questions, could they email you? And if so, how would they do it?
Sure. You can email me directly at Jared, Jared.Connors, Connors, at redflaggroup.com. So that's Jared.Connors at redflaggroup.com.
And Jared will be leading a much more detailed webinar on this topic Thursday, September 17th, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. I'm going to give the link to the show in the show notes, but if you wanted to check it out, go to the Red Flag Group website at www.redflaggroup.com, webinars. Jared, as always, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Look forward to the next one.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. As we mentioned several times in the podcast, there will be a much more comprehensive webinar on Thursday, September 15th at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, or Central Daylight Time. For more information on the webinar and registration, which of course is free, you can go to the Red Flag Group website, www.redflaggroup.com/webinars. I hope you will check it out, and I hope you will continue to listen to the FCPA Compliance Report. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode.